Another great and dynamic speaker that's going to share with us. As we've committed as a covenant community to pray at the beginning of every one of our meetings and our engagements, shall we pray together? We thank you, Almighty God, for this moment. Thank you for this space, this opportunity to breathe again. We thank you for the ways in which you manifest yourself. Thank you for the air we breathe, the water we drink. Thank you for the relationships we're cultivating. Thank you for friends. I thank you for friends who are present in this space and those who are connecting with us online. We pray today that you would enlighten us, that you would bless us, and that you would enrich us. We give your name praise, glory, thanks, and honor. Amen. Our presenter this morning, Dr. Joy Orr, is an assistant professor of Christian ethics at the Interdenominational Theological Center in Atlanta, Georgia, working at the intersections of Black religious studies, social ethics, and environmental justice. Her scholarship argues for African American land security and food sovereignty as a necessary component of social justice and Black liberation. She also teaches, writes, and presents on the history of African American land dispossession, radical politics, Black utopian imaginations, and food justice. I want to again put it on record. She was the first scholar I called, and she has been instrumental in helping me think about what this commemoration and conference is really all about. Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, our presenter, Dr. Joy Orr.
Thank you. Good morning. Is my mic on? Am I okay? You can hear me? All right. Let me get set up here. Now, I hear Mercury is in retrograde, so let's cross our fingers that we don't have any issues. Amen? Okay. Pastor Brawley, thank you so much for this invitation to participate in this very important commemoration of the MAAFA. And to the St. Paul community, it is a privilege and an honor to be with you. And to the IAF, I, many lifetimes ago, thought I would be a full-time organizer. There's still time, yes. So I'm glad to be in community with you this morning. I bring you greetings from Atlanta, Georgia, which is a territory that was once sovereignly stewarded by the Cherokee and the lower Muskogee Creek tribes before the terror of white colonialism. And it is a city that is cultivated by the hands of stolen Africans, and to this day remains a touchstone of the American Civil Rights Movement. Now, if I may, I need to make an important correction to the theme for this talk, and this is my bad for not reading close enough, and I'll just go ahead and blame Mercury retrograde again. To be clear, one of the problems that we are facing is not land scarcity. There is enough land for all of us. The problem before us is the greed of corporations and governments that are taking land out from under Black folks, from Native folks, from indigenous folks all around the globe. The problem we face today is land theft and food insecurity. Okay. So to begin, picture a large billboard in Chicago, and it reads, "By any greens necessary." The sign is advertising a local farmers market and is sponsored by the Trinity United Church in Christ, comrades of this congregation. I'm not sure if it's still up, but it was a few years ago. And as you know, Trinity is an Afrocentric Christian church known for its unapologetic militancy and freedom struggles over many generations. And now it is one of a growing number of Black congregations and communities in the fight against food insecurity. So what is food insecurity? You can change the slide. Food insecurity is the inability to access nutrient-rich foods and fresh produce. In the United States, more than 38 million people, including 12 million children, are food insecure. Unsurprisingly, Black communities are disproportionately food insecure relative to white communities, a fact which has led food activist Karen Washington to reframe food insecurity as food apartheid. Food insecure communities in which a supermarket or a grocery store is over 2 miles away are defined by the U.S. Department of Agriculture as food deserts. And residents of food deserts are disproportionately debilitated by diet-related diseases, including hypertension, coronary heart disease, and diabetes. Next slide. In response to food insecurity, activists around the world are fighting for food sovereignty. As defined by the leading agrarian justice coalition, Via Campesina, food sovereignty is the right of each community to develop and maintain its own capacity to produce basic foods, respecting cultural crop diversity and agricultural techniques. It is the right to produce one's own food. A right that you would imagine should not be under threat, and yet it is. Decades after Via Campesina first defined what was mostly a movement of peasant farmers in the global South, the term food sovereignty has been adopted by Black communities across the United States. And this isn't too surprising given that Black revolutionaries have long believed that liberation is predicated on a community's ability to produce its own food and securely steward land. Slide 4. Indeed, for centuries, generations of Black radicals have known one thing to be true: liberation is from the ground up. For all intents and purposes, the Black food sovereignty movement echoes the practice of antebellum Maroonage, all the way to the free the land and back to the land movements of the 1960s and the 1970s, right? Hence, Trinity's allusion to Malcolm X and the Black Power movement, right? By any means necessary. Malcolm X, in his message to the grassroots, unequivocally declared that revolution is based on land. Land is the basis of all independence. Land is the basis of freedom, justice, and equality. And so for Black activists, sovereignty, food sovereignty, is what it means to be free, and food and land are liberty's primary ingredients. Next slide. So I want to spend the remainder of my time introducing you to a collective of Black folks who have taken up the mantle of securing food and land for their community. In 2019 into 2020, I had the privilege and honor of learning from the Black Church Food Security Network, and this was some interviews and participant observation that I conducted for my dissertation research. Founded by the Reverend Dr. Heber Brown, the network is a coalition of Black churches, mosques, temples, and secular nonprofits, and Black-owned farms that are constructing an independent, community-controlled, farm-to-table or farm-to-church distribution system. Okay. When I began my field work, the network included about 11 churches and mosques in Baltimore City, 10 in Ohio, 5 in Virginia. Since then, it has expanded tremendously, including churches in Philadelphia, I think New York, and Delaware as well. The network also includes partnerships with growers, Black growers and farmers in Tennessee, North Carolina, Virginia, and Maryland. And in the context of COVID-19, right, and the social unrest against police brutality, the network exploded in membership and interest. They boast having partners now as far as Zimbabwe and Nigeria. Day to day, the network helps churches grow gardens, host farmers markets, and host educational webinars. And 3 summers ago, as folks began sheltering in place because of COVID-19, they hosted a webinar series named Building Community Resilience, recognizing that residents would have a hard time receiving food charity and because of the shortages in the grocery stores, because of the pandemic. And the course's objective was to help participants learn how to propagate herbs and vegetables that they bought from the grocery store. Right? You don't even need seeds. You can take your food scraps and make them new again. Also, before the pandemic, and they just restarted this year, I believe, the network and the garden volunteers were hosting a Soil to Sanctuary farmers market. The market, which was a fellowship hall turned old school bazaar, right? It sold produce from the network's garden along with a number of growers along the eastern seaboard. And on nights before the market, volunteers would bundle the pre-sale orders of culturally relevant vegetables like collard greens and sweet potatoes into $5 and $7 bags. And they are storing the produce in a dedicated refrigerator off the main office. And they had other vendors sell at the market too. And the goods range from home decor to homemade desserts. Next slide, please. So I asked Reverend Brown if I could interview his members and spend some time with the network, because what I saw from afar, and I'm gonna say Reverend Brown has been a colleague of mine for decades now, but what I saw from afar and from our conversations was a group of folks practicing the radical imagination. Right? And the radical imagination is envisioning Black liberation as Black folks reconnected to the land. So let me share with you the origin story of the network. My goal today is to put their work in the context of revolutionary activism. And from there, I'll share more details around the theological and political motivations behind their work. And my hope is that you'll be inspired by the work of the network, perhaps challenged by the work of the network, and pushed to have conversations with them or partner with them or replicate their activities in your own communities. Because if you're passionate about Black liberation, you must be passionate about food. Okay, so origins. In 2010, Reverend Brown started having some aha moments. He began noticing that most of his hospital visits as a pastor were to members battling food-related diseases. And so he began centering food as a central ministry. What he realized, in addition to people being hungry, right, lacking access to food, is that the food that folks did have were slowly killing them. So he established a vegetable garden. It was called Maxine's Garden, on a small 1,500 square foot plot of land owned by the congregation he once shepherded, Pleasant Hope Baptist Church. He just retired this spring from the congregation. The garden, small community garden, sits next to the left of the church, facing the street, and it's so modest that if you're not walking by, you might miss it. It's named Maxine's Garden after Mother Maxine Nichols, whom Pastor Brown credits with keeping the garden alive and thriving. She was born in Roanoke, North Carolina, and Mother Nichols was a longtime Baltimore resident. She has since passed, but the garden lives on. Maxine's Garden was established to mitigate diet-related diseases correlated to living in a food desert. The city of Baltimore defines a food desert as, quote, an area where the distance to a supermarket or a supermarket alternative is more than a quarter of a mile. The median household income is at or below 150% of the federal poverty level. Over 30% of households have no vehicle available, and where the average healthy food availability index score for all food stores is low. A report by the Johns Hopkins Center for a Livable Future, in collaboration with the Baltimore Policy Initiative, found that 1 in 4 Baltimore residents and 30% of school-aged children live in a food desert. Among African Americans, 34% lived in food deserts, compared to only 8% of white residents. It's worth noting that Dr. Brown now refuses, like activist Karen Washington, now refuses to say food deserts when describing the food insecurity in his community. Right? Instead, he refers to the food insecurity as food apartheid. And he argues that nothing is wrong with a natural desert. Right? One can find life in a desert. There exist animals and plant life that are acclimated to thrive in arid conditions. However, food deserts are not natural ecologies, and Black life suffers under the conditions of food insecurity. As a classification, then, food desert obscures the systemic racism in the corporate and legislative decisions that create and sustain segregated and unequal access to food. In other words, food deserts do not just occur. Food deserts are made. All right, slide 7, please. Next slide. So who makes food deserts? To explain food insecurity, a number of development scholars turn to Harriet Friedman's theory of international food regimes. According to Friedman, food regimes are, quote, a specific constellation of governments, corporations, collective organizations, and individuals, end quote, that through global governing bodies, unregulated transnational trade, and the corporate takeover of domestic agriculture aim to remove the social and political barriers to the free flow of capital in food and agriculture. For profit, the current regime has monopolized the industrial agri-foods complex, which is the world's food-producing resource, such as land, labor, water, air, and even seeds. Right. The regime disappears indigenous agrarian knowledges and people to subject the land to unsustainable agricultural practices such as monocultural farming. In monocultural farming, right, in contradistinction to sustainable agricultural practices like crop rotation and plant diversity, leads to soil erosion. Right? Think about the 1930s Dust Bowl, right, when we only planted wheat. It eroded the soil. Right? And this practice ultimately contributes to global warming. It also demands that peasant and small-scale farmers sacrifice their land, and it subjects agricultural workers to brutal working conditions and unlivable wages, thereby creating a class of citizens for whom self-sufficiency is always out of reach. And domestically in the United States, the agri-food industrial complex has taken land from Black farmers for centuries. Black farmers now represent about 1% of farmers in the United States. At the height, around 1910, I believe, they represented about 14, 15%. Left unchecked, the food regime will continue to divide the world's population into the wealthy few, who can afford the nutritious, high-quality foods, and the poor, who are conscripted to produce the nutritious foods they cannot afford or legally produce. The polls look like the divide between Serenbe, which is a luxury agri-hood outside of Atlanta that offers sidewalks lined with edible vegetation and farm-to-table restaurants, versus plantations in South Georgia where trafficked workers were brutally forced to pull onions from the ground with their bare hands. In other words, the legitimate worry is that industrial farms and food deserts will devolve into what critical theorist Giorgio Agamben calls a camp, a place where humans are reduced to bare life, or the minimal requirements of biological survival in order to sustain state corporate power. In the camp is a metaphor and a symbol that is a reference to the camps during the Holocaust. And scholars might argue that in terms of food sovereignty, in terms of food insecurity, a more appropriate metaphor might be the camp of the American plantation. That is the worry, that human society will devolve into the wealthy few who sit on high hills and the plantations of those who are hungry. And if not a devolution into these prefigurative camps or neo-plantations, right? The worry is that food deserts will remain as what Catherine McKittrick might call demonic grounds of state corporate power. Right? Food deserts are bounded geographies in which the human right of self-sufficiency and access to life-sustaining food is suspended for market-driven profits. And given the state violence, surveillance, and the force of the militarized police that consumes so many Black communities, one might argue that the camp is closer than we care to admit. In fact, the network was truly birthed as a response to both state violence and food insecurity. It was one Tuesday night, I had the privilege of learning the network's origin story in the church kitchen while bagging pre-sale orders of collard greens and sweet potatoes. The Nation of Islam was preparing to host a public event in the sanctuary when Pastor Brown and one of the ministers, one of the NOI ministers, were backstage sharing mutual admiration for each other's work in the community. As you may know, food and health have long been central to NOI teachings, and they have long advocated Black food sovereignty. In 1994, the Nation established Muhammad Farms in Broadwood, Georgia, and they have about 1,500 acres, and their mission is to feed the 40 million Black people in America. So they are not yet feeding every Black person in America, but the food grown on the farm is distributed to NOI mosques around the country. And so back in the kitchen, right, Reverend Brown shared that he was influenced by the NOI's food ministry, but he also shared that he established the Black Church Food Security Network because of the Baltimore Uprising. Not just hospital visits, but the uprising of Charm City. Next slide, please. Do you remember the uprising? Yeah. The Baltimore uprisings began when the city learned that Freddie Gray, a young Black male resident of Baltimore, West Baltimore, died in police custody after a questionable arrest. Resident witnesses argued that there was no reason for Gray's arrest, but the police justified the arrest, reporting that Gray was carrying a switchblade. Witnesses argued that Gray's arrest was not only unjust, but a violent encounter in which he was slammed to the ground so forcefully he appeared to have lost the use of his legs. And the police report contends that the arrest happened without excessive force. But once arriving at the police station, the paramedics are called and Gray is taken to the trauma center where it is reported that he suffered from a broken spine and a crushed voice box. He was a victim of what they call a rough ride, placed in a police paddy wagon without restraint. Gray remained in a coma for a week and died on Sunday, April 19, 2015. And to date, no one has been held accountable for Gray's untimely and mysteriously violent arrest. It was April 27th, the day of Gray's funeral, when Charm City exploded. The force of police brutality became too much to bear. And at the height of the unrest, Mayor Rawlins Blake persuaded Governor Hogan to sign a state of emergency, after which the National Guard took over Baltimore. And with that, the city center, including schools and businesses, shut down and a curfew was established. And that is when Pastor Brown started receiving phone calls. When the city shut down, when schools closed, and charitable nonprofits could no longer provide food aids, the residents called the church. Residents and activists knew that Pastor Brown had a garden. It was his communal calling card, he says. And this was the moment in which he realized just how dependent his community had become on a system that is outside of their control and that treats Black bodies like Freddie's as disposable, criminal, and valueless. He realized that at a moment's notice, the city could completely divest from Black life. And in the spirit of the uprising, he realized that his community could never be free as long as they depended on the state and charity for their food. And that is why he founded the Black Church Food Security Network. For Brown and for so many others, the riots pulled back the wool that had been laid over their eyes. For Brown, the uprising inspired him to ask, why aren't we organizing? Not for more protests and not more acts of civil disobedience, but for mass divestment from the system that killed Freddie Gray and the system that confines Black life to deserts. By growing food and securing land, the network's activism represents a divestment, from an anti-Black superstructure where food apartheid and police brutality go hand in hand. For Pastor Brown, resistance most radically starts with controlling food and the land. Because what? Revolution is based on land. Land is the basis of all independence. Land is the basis of freedom, justice, and equality. And so I'm telling you this story of the network's origin to put into context the work that they are engaged in. Right? And the work that Black food sovereignty activists around the country are engaged in. They are engaged in radical revolutionary work, system redesign. Right? Next slide. The divestment that the network engages is what I like to think of as fugitive planning and fugitive practice. A fugitive is one who engages in political refusal, the politics of refusal. As theorized by Saidiya Hartman, a practice of refusal is a refusal of a subjecthood that is predicated on death, fungibility, precarity, and disposability. However, and this is important, a politics of refusal is not a static state of negation. It's not just being ornery for ornery's sake. Refusal, explains theorist Tina Camp, is a generative and creative source of disorderly power to embrace the possibility of living otherwise. Let us refuse the systems that create precarity and disposability of Black life, and in doing so, let us imagine otherwise. The activist as fugitive, then, is one who abandons the exclusion that produces their precarity and diminished subjecthood and sets out to create new worlds in which their self-determination and moral agency are unencumbered by state corporate control. And I see the network's fugitive practice of food sovereignty as being rooted in at least 3 important principles. Next slide. What I've seen from conversations and interviews and conversations, particularly with Reverend Brown, is an emphasis on asset-based community development, Black communalism and negotiated separatism, and a 21st century Maroonage. And so I'll spend the rest of my time going through some of my observations, and then we can open up for some conversation, okay? So asset-based community development. The network, while divesting from life-sacrificing systems, is investing in alternative, life-affirming systems and structures. They do so by utilizing an asset-based approach in organizing and linking the vast resources of historically African-American congregations in rural and urban communities to food and land sovereignty. So asset-based community development, as I'm sure many of you are probably well familiar with, is often referred to as a self-help strategy for community building. And community activists are often drawn to the model for its emphasis on assets like talents, hobbies, material, or social capital or financial capital. It has its critics, and I think there are important conversations to be had, but I think it is an interesting way in thinking about how do we bring people together to change their communities and their circumstances. Proponents of ABCD, asset-based community development, believe that communities already have within them the gifts and resources that they need to survive and thrive. And they contend that a needs-based community development strategy is ineffective because a needs-based, as opposed to an asset-based strategy, focuses on problems and labels like at-risk or poor or homeless, which encourages community members to internalize their issues and in turn remain dependent on social services. To encourage independence and self-sufficiency, leaders nurture assets because organizing individuals around their assets as opposed to their needs makes for healthy communities. And assets are defined on a case-by-case basis. So for example, in the network's case, in terms of this alternative food system that they are constructing along the I-95 corridor, Not every church member, not every member congregation has an ideal set of assets for growing a garden, for example. However, a particular church might have a considerable amount of building space or financial capital. So instead of growing a garden, a congregation with a large kitchen could offer their space to store industrial-sized refrigerators for local farmers or growers. The idea is get in where you fit in, right? Not everyone needs to replicate the same positionality. The network's collective assets include social and economic resources, such as church buildings, congregant skills and talents, money, which includes tithes, offerings, and outside donations, and most importantly, land. There are organizations now who are engaging in land mapping projects to see just how much land Black folks own. And you know which collective of Black folks owns a lot of land? Churches. Churches. Moreover, the network identifies as unapologetically Black and Afrocentric, right? Which for the network is an asset. So the community's assets in this regard includes practices and rituals that are rooted in African communalism, West African religious worldviews, Afro-Christian worship, and African-American food cultures. Furthermore, the network's asset-based investment is motivated by a strain of Black Christian nationalism that takes seriously the violence of an anti-Black modernity, a modernity where Freddie Gray's murder is not an anomaly, but an expected and accepted part of everyday life. Black Christian nationalism is a philosophy that undergirds the network, and it was founded, or at least articulated, by the Reverend Albert Clegg Jr., who founded the Shrine of the Black Madonna in Detroit in the late 50s, early 60s. And there are now shrines in Atlanta and Houston, and they sit under the Pan-African Orthodox Christian Church denomination. Clegg defines Black Christian nationalism as, quote unquote, pragmatic realism, although this definition hardly speaks to the philosophy's revolutionary nature. The philosophy is an actual book, it's a text as well, reads like a manifesto against white supremacy and what he calls the white man's declaration of Black inferiority. And it proclaims that Black Christian nationalists are committed to, quote, a total struggle for Black liberation by any means necessary, end quote. For Clegg, the Black church's highest calling is to avail itself to the Black struggle for liberation. Nothing is more sacred than the liberation of Black people. Furthermore, he preached that the Black church's involvement in the Black Revolution is the only hope for the Black nation because the church is the most asset-rich institution in Black communities and because the Black Messiah demands it. Ultimately, the Black church exists for Black liberation. So for Clegg, the struggle for Black liberation requires the church to create educational programs aimed at self-determination. So in addition to the network, Reverend Brown's work at Pleasant Hope Baptist hosted a number of ministries that were aimed towards this objective of Black self-determination. They hosted Arita's Cross Freedom School, as an example, as part of the church's asset-based programming. The school, administered by volunteers, is hosted on school district holidays and teacher professional development days when students are out of school, but when parents still have to work. The Freedom School is an extension of Brown's program for self-determination, and in following Clegg's program, it is African-centered. It also functions as what I see as evangelism for Black liberation theology, as some of the network's volunteers joined the church and joined the network after joining a freedom school. One network volunteer says that he came to the network through the church's freedom school because it unapologetically centered and nurtured Black children, which he found important for his family. And Brown's public lectures and appearances are, in effect, evangelism as well. After hearing Pastor Brown speak about Black liberation at Morgan State University, which is his alma mater, and at HBCU, Another network volunteer joined the church. Right? Another volunteer came to the church after seeing the church's Afrocentric involvement in the community. She confessed that she was a millennial who gave up on the church, right, for years. And as a city planner, she strove for Black liberation by reforming the system from the inside out. She thought that was the way that she could make a change. But eventually, she lost hope in that strategy. But when she met Brown and learned about the network's investment in the community, this unapologetically Afrocentric investment into the community for the sake of self-determination, she was convinced to return to the church. So let me say a word about Black communalism and negotiated separatism. So in addition to revolutionary Black theology, Black communalism and Black separatism are fundamental to Clegg's program for Black liberation and self-determination, and the network follows these programmatic mandates to some degree. In explaining the importance of Black communalism, Clegg writes, unless we can discard the white man's individualistic slave theology and accept a Black theology which emphasizes the Black nation and a communal way of life in a promised land here on earth, Black people are doomed to genocide or an eternal hell on earth. This turning away from individualism is more than just an embrace of collective economics, right? For Clegg, abandoning individualism is a spiritual and social turn towards communalism, and it is fundamental for the Black revolution. And Black separatism is just as important as Black communalism for Clegg as well. The two ideologies and practices go hand in hand. Influenced by Reinhold Niebuhr's Moral Man and Immoral Society, Clegg accepts that contest for power between social groups as an inevitable part of life. But influenced by Malcolm X, he believes that the asymmetric power dynamic between white and Black communities is only overcome by building Black power. And this power shift can only happen once Black people accept the reality of de facto segregation and exploit it for their good. So he's not advocating that Black folks leave American society altogether. What he's acknowledging is that we're already segregated, and so let us exploit that to build our own power. So discarding the white man's individualistic slave theology for Clegg requires a wholesale rejection of the dream of integration, which serves as the mechanism for our continuing enslavement, he says. And so separatism is not a dirty word for the network. When I asked the network's deputy director, who was Siobhan Terrell at the time, if the network is a Black nationalist movement, by which I meant a separatist movement, she answered yes. And she says she's comfortable calling the movement Black nationalist because their strategy for community self-determination is focused on empowering those most directly affected by food insecurity. Like Clegg, Brown, and Terrell are not principally against associating with white people or white-led organizations. That's not the point, again. Separatism for Clegg merely means that we recognize that our concerns are different and our objectives are different. And so Terrell explains their work in terms of FUBU, right? For us, by us. She says we are leading those directly affected by food security from mere survival to thrival. And for Terrell, thriving means being self-sufficient, self-supported, and having choices, self-determination. When it comes to community partnerships, foundation grants, and its relationship with state welfare agencies, the network practices what I call a pragmatic negotiated separatism. This negotiated separatism is to ensure the sustainability of the organization, which may be a smart decision that is substantiated by research in political science. In fact, in a study of community development corporations, CDCs, that are owned by Black churches in New York, political scientist Michael Leo Owens found that church-state partnerships might, in the long run, negatively affect Black communities. Specifically, he concluded, excuse me, I lost my place, that church-state collaboration may produce only marginal improvements in neighborhood socioeconomic conditions, at least in the short term, 2 decades or less. Poverty rates may not decline, employment rates may not rise, other measures of decline and progress remain constant. So in theory, resources provided to communities through church-state collaboration should produce self-sufficiency and economic mobility. But empirically, according to research, church-state collaborations do not create lasting social change in poor Black communities. Quoting Adolph Reed Jr., another political science, Owens warns that precisely by the virtue of their capacities for delivering benefits, church-state collaborations could potentially demobilize residents from engaging in more radical politics. And in Judith Good's research of church-state collaboration in Philadelphia, she found that partly as a result of the availability of welfare reform funding and the rising discourse of capacity building, state-funded programs aimed at individual reform tended to temper Alinsky-style community building and political resistance. So this negotiated separatism from the state is a pragmatic strategy for the sake of the organization's sustainability. Completely divesting from the state is hardly feasible in this day and age, we know that, right? Even less so as Black urbanites. Thus, the network continues to negotiate how it might be of service to its community while maintaining a politics of refusal of the state's politics and actions. Moreover, as aforementioned, it was precisely an overdependence on state aid and the state's withdrawal of aid that motivated Pastor Brown to begin the network in the first place. Thus, this negotiated separatism is still a refusal of the status quo and an acknowledgement of the difficulties that pure separatism from racist institutions might present. So this negotiation is ongoing and necessary as they attempt to protect and secure a social imaginary of an alternative future of Black liberation and freedom while in the midst of institutions that perpetuate the afterlife of slavery. Before concluding, I want to talk about this idea of the 21st century Maroonage. And my committee was like, that is provocative, it needs a little bit more. So this is something we can talk about as well. I want to suggest that the network's asset-based community development, its Black communalism, its negotiated separatism and divestment, all combined with its regional land and food networks, can be read as a 21st century Maroonage. It is Maroonage in the afterlife of slavery, a mode of political and social fugitivity enacted through interconnected geographies. Okay. So developing this proposal, as I said, certainly requires some more study and participant observation, but I believe it is a compelling way to think about the network strategy as an escape from a plantation that has in effect extended itself everywhere. In Slavery's Exile, the story of American Maroons, Sylvian A. Diouf defines American Maroons as Africans who escaped slavery to live in the woods. Driven by a desire for autonomy, they settled in the wilderness, lived in secrecy, and lived outside any external control. And what is particularly insightful about Diouf's study is her explication of the mode of Maroonage, how it actually happened. Maroons are commonly imagined as hiding deep in the woods and hiding deep in the swamplands. However, Diouf argues that Maroonage is better understood not as this static exile that was completely and far removed from society, or concealment as a practice in which Africans were anchored in the woods, but as a practice in which they were in the woods, but also traversed interconnected areas within a larger landscape. So there was a fluid nature to the Maroon landscape. According to her research, Maroons were anchored in borderlands, which were uncontrolled territories outside the scope of the plantation landscape. And the borderlands were, quote, spaces of freedom that provided what enslaved people were denied elsewhere: autonomy, mobility, enterprise, a sense of physical security, freedom from scrutiny, control over their time and movement, and access to varied foods, end quote. However, the Maroons did not confine themselves to the borderlands. Instead, the Maroon landscape was overlaid atop the intersection of three geographies: the borderland refuge, white-controlled territories, including plantation fields and big houses, and the physical and social space in between plantations carved out by the enslaved. For survival, the Maroons maintained a symbiotic relation with these three geographical territories. In this way, they could cautiously appropriate the materials and goods they needed for their survival. And in traversing this fluid landscape over and over, they created an environment that functioned as a space of interdependence, networks, and exchange. And so what I propose is that, like the antebellum Maroons, the network has a borderland refuge, which began as the church, as Pleasant Hope Baptist Church. And like the Maroons, they traverse interconnected geographies for the sake of their survival. They are connected to other churches in Baltimore and throughout the Mideast region, and they are connected to Black-owned farms along the I-95 interstate corridors. And through these networks, they gather food, supplies, and sustainable agricultural methods that support their political fugitivity. Next slide. So in closing, again, the movement for food sovereignty is more than a public health initiative calling for reform or for more charitable distributions. The food sovereignty movement rejects the premise that solutions to hunger and food insecurity depend effectively on commodifying more natural resources. Right? Instead, food sovereignty represents a refusal, a politics of refusal of a globally commodified food system in favor of systems and institutions that support self-sufficient communities. And given the immense harm that a commodified food system has inflicted upon Black communities in the US, people in the global South, and the environment, the fight for food sovereignty is not just about food. The fight is a contest between sovereign wills, right? The sovereignty of corporations, nation states, the sovereignty of the people, and for the network, the sovereignty of a Black Messiah. It is a fight. The movement for food sovereignty is a fight for life itself, a fight activists intend to win by any means necessary. Folks all over the country are growing food for Black liberation because they know, without a doubt, that liberation is from the ground up. Thank you.
One more time, let's thank our presenter today, Dr. Joy Orr. She's given us much to think about today. We do have a microphone to my right if anyone wants to raise any questions in this moment, and I do have one to prime the pump. As you talked about today, the Food Network and all that's going on, can you help us to think about what liberation is going to look like when we do it locally, the work being more local than anything else? Can you help us contextualize that?
Yeah, so I think you're picking up on another key principle of this work is that it is a hyper-localized fight here in the United States and elsewhere, because the premise of food sovereignty is the right for a community to control their access to food, to control what foods are being produced, and so with that, to control their access to land, water, seeds, and other materials in order to build their food. So it's not really a movement that is scaled up. It's a national and an international movement of local communities. Right? And so part of the work of the church, part of the work of organizations like IAF is really talking to folks about what it means to be in community and what that looks like, and really honing in on the importance on being neighborly. Right? So I think that's part of the definition of food sovereignty. It is a hyper local movement and initiative. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Are there others with questions in this moment?
Questions?
The microphone there? Yeah, but we can't hear you on the stream.
Yes.
You're going viral right now. You're
Yeah.
going viral right
Talk
now.
back to me, questions, or if you feel like I said something crazy, I'll take that too.
So I thank you, Dr. Orr.
Is it on?
Okay. I thank you for your presentation. I have a question about how do you help restore areas where the erosion has happened. So my family's from Haiti. Anything that you know about the country of Haiti is that a lot of that, it's a huge food desert now because of the robbery of the land and the resources. So how would you help a community or a country like Haiti to redevelop their land? Because now that's a huge issue, access to resources, to food, to plant, to build again when the land has been corrupted, when the land has been eroded.
Yeah, Haiti is like a case study for sure in what happens when corporations and governments not only steal the land, but deplete the land. Absolutely. So what I've been seeing happen, and I was actually just I was in Palestine a few months ago, and I visited a few farms that are also working to restore depleted land. And it's really a practice of Sankofa, going back and fetching it for the future. What they're doing is they're retrieving indigenous ways of agriculture, right? Instead of the monocultural farming that the agricultural companies do for profit, like just grow one crop for acres and acres and acres for the sake of profit, they're now doing farms that are focused on plant diversity. So you build a farm that, I'm going to plant this basil here, I'm going to plant tomatoes here because tomatoes will give shade for the basil will deposit nitrogen in the soil, that nitrogen will then grow this. It's about going back and uncovering and reclaiming indigenous ways of farming and growing. Our ancestors knew how to keep the soil fertile, and so part of the work in restoring the land is restoring those indigenous ways of growing. So that's just one step, yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. Dr. Brown came to our MAAFA presentation in Bridgeport last year.
Okay.
Just blew us away. My question is, what continues to motivate you, and then what are some of the biggest challenges that you're facing as you go across to share this?
Yeah. I hope this doesn't sound like too woo-woo, but I am sitting in a church with some religious people, so it probably won't. But part of my studies now are utopian studies, and it's really just thinking about and trying to imagine what freedom might look like. What are ways of living otherwise? What do Black people in the future look like? What do they eat? How are their communities constructed? What are the ethics of that? Right? What does solidarity look like? All of the things that we know now to be unethical practices and legacies of injustice, how do we remix that for the future? And so I am motivated by thinking about what Black folks in the future look like. Obviously, the challenge is maintaining this type of hope in the face of grand injustice and suffering. Right? So it is always a balancing act. Not every day is as happy as the one before, but I think that is, the good Christian folks can relate to that. Yeah.
Amen. We have, I think, 2 more questions, and then we'll wrap up.
Thank you for your presentation. Your second statement about separation,
Yeah.
you said something radical to me that kind of shook me, that since we're already segregated, we should just separate ourselves. I think I heard something to that. You said not leave the country, but are we talking about seceding from the country?
So I don't think so.
Okay.
Although part of my studies, I do study very radical back to the land movements, and that for some folks that is their objective, and I get it. I get why that would be their objective. I think what Albert Clegg was saying was we're already separated. We're already segregated. And remember, he's writing in the late 60s. So he's like, we're already segregated. Why then should we put all of our assets into integration instead of building up the assets of the communities that we're already in? So this, I'm saying, is a negotiated separatism. It's not an active separatism like let us divorce ourselves from the rest of society. But since we're already siloed into these communities, since we're already siloed as Black folks, how can we use that to our advantage? And so that's part of his emphasis then is on let's build up Black communalism, let's build up Black capitalism, Black commerce, let's focus our energies on building up the assets in the communities that we're already in.
Thank you.
Black Wall Street, yeah.
Yes, again, thank you for your presentation. I'm from Baltimore, and I spent some time at a church that did do a garden, fresh garden, and they had the women and men of the church who maintained that. And many people did go to the garden.
Yeah.
But we have a generation that likes fast food, doesn't take the time to fix food, doesn't understand the importance of the nutrients of food. And so I was wondering, when you were working with Reverend Brown, did he talk about a component of teaching us the importance of the foods that we eat?
Yes, yes. That was definitely a focus of the network as well. So in the Freedom School that I talked about, which housed the school-aged children on the federal holidays and teacher days, there will be classes on okay, what are the nutrients of the food, cooking classes, how do we prepare healthy food, and then also sponsored workshops and webinars for the larger Baltimore community around food. But let me also add to that too, one of the reasons why it's not just, a generational thing, oh, these young folks or folks, all these Northerners are separated from the food. There is a real and lasting trauma with the land that we have yet to heal. Right? From slavery, from Reconstruction, in which slavery was reconstructed into slavery by another name, and then generations of land dispossessions. Black folks have real somatic trauma with the land. And that is something that we have to take some steps to heal. That's something I'm going to talk about this evening when we talk about remembering the land. And so part is not just teaching, part of it is teaching healthy ways of eating and the importance of eating healthy produce and produce that is full of macro and micronutrients. But part of it too is healing our trauma with the land so that the idea of food and growing one's own food it's not this foreign thing, or it's not this thing that, oh, that's not something Black people do, right? There's this healing that needs to take place as well.
Thank you again, Dr. Orr. Thank you for this first installment. We look forward to tonight. And we also have Dr. Otis Moss III, who will present tonight and will also be a recipient of our Ubuntu Award. I want to acknowledge another recipient is with us today. Dr. Bennett is the first recipient of our Ubuntu Award for prophetic ministry and sacred memory. And so to our streaming audience, thank you for being with us. We'll see you again this evening at 7 o'clock. We'll gather again at 7 o'clock for our next presentation. Thank you, and whatever you do, don't let anybody steal your joy or rob your peace. Blessings. Amen.